Okay, cool. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm really sorry about the delay this morning. I was on a panel and we had technical difficulties, and it was both pushed back and I ended up streaming the video. Um, so I kind of got sucked into that and couldn't leave early. So, but we are here now. I just shared the agenda, issue 165. We have the normal stuff, and we have a couple of other things, including talking about incident response, um, weak subjectivity, a quick sanity check on the updated hash curve 9, which I didn't know existed until now, and other things. Cool. So we will go ahead and get started. Testing release updates. We have V0.12.2 is queued, but we are still working on a few things. It's backwards compatible, some clarifications and fixes in the network spec, and we are the blocker on getting this out is tuning the gossip subparameters. There were a couple that were obviously not prime for the kind of the Eth2 config, especially in the context of thinking about slots and how long it takes for messages to get propagated. So we have a couple updates to that coming, and are in some conversations with our friends at Protocol Labs to sanity check and go through all the other parameters before this next release. Those all will be backwards compatible, updating the parameters locally, but obviously we get a more cohesive gossip strategy as everyone upgrades. Proto, do you want to give any update on the rumor, chain tests, things like that?
Sure. Um, Last week I released a new rumor update. I've been making slight changes since. So the scripting greatly improved. Lots of new commands to debug stuff with. Not every new command is polished yet. I'm working on the chain related commands. Sync is more complicated when you do the full thing instead of directing what to sync, but like we're managing the chain. RPC test workdown has a new step functionality, so you can wait for responses and requests and all that. And then some other testing comments. So for phase one, test generation is getting started, being enabled. And for Python, a updated Eth2 fastback, the optimized version of the PySpec, along with trying some optimizations in Lodestar, which is making great progress there. And that was my update.
Cool. And Proto, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're currently thinking that handling fork choice tests via rumor style testing is going to be a more tractable approach, and that's kind of what we're holding off right now. The Alex generated tests for TXRX exist, and we encourage you to use them if you want some additional testing there, but that we're going to take the approach of chain tests here.
So the problem with like these tests, I'm releasing a tutorial for rumor and explanation and background why this was chosen. Like the too long didn't read is that integrating another set of interfaces in every other client to inject blocks and inject attestations and have it be like at least somewhat real is quite difficult. It requires more client standardization and like basically ignores the protocol. So I'd rather have through the protocol have something that injects all the data and tests the client. And to do this elegantly, I hope that we can have scripts define like which blocks to import and then which blocks to serve, and that's it. Like keep it very minimal, but also very useful to serve the data.
Right. So a test might look like I gossip you directly 3 blocks, 5 attestations, and then your status is going to tell me that you have the head that I expect. Something like that.
Pretty much.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thank you for all of that. If you haven't looked at Rumor's getting pretty awesome and pretty powerful recently, and might just be useful to you. So like getting just a handle on what this tool can do, I think would be valuable. At least having someone from your team take a look at it would be good. Cool. Mehdi's here, I think, to give us an update about fuzzing.
Yep. Hey everyone. Just a quick update on Beacon Fuzz. I've just finished writing our latest blog post. Should be live in a few hours, where we announce the completion of the Dockerization process of Eth2.0 Fuzz. So as a reminder, the idea is to enable community fuzzing, or fuzzing at home, as Danny calls it. We have super detailed set of instructions. You can even set it all up to fuzz all clients on all targets. You'll spend 1 hour per fuzzing target and move on to the next one. I guess I'd like to thank Justin, who came up with the idea originally and who's helped us test this and troubleshoot this. We've created the Discord channel so people can report bugs if they find any, and we can help them troubleshoot their setup if they have any issues. In other news, we've identified two high severity vulnerabilities lately, one on Nimbus and one on Lodestar. The Nimbus one is an index error that can be triggered over the wire externally with the attester slashing processing function. So basically, due to a lack of input validation, when the attestation validation function is called, you can get the client to crash. This was fixed super quickly, as always, by the Nimbus team. And the other one, as I mentioned, was on Lodestar. It's a memory exhaustion vulnerability when passing invalid ENRs. So you can basically maliciously craft ENR strings, and those can trigger a JavaScript heap out of memory error, which can cause the entire JavaScript process to crash. One of the panics we identified while fuzzing the Lighthouse on an upstream library, namely the snappy crate, has finally been patched. We submitted a PR about 2 months ago, and the maintainer finally merged that one in. So it's a bit of a relief. I was a bit worried that we'd have to maintain our own patched version. So all good on that front. And I guess now that the state transition spec is pretty much finalized, we're shifting our efforts back to the differential part of Beacon Fuzz. So Eth2 Fuzz and Eth2 Diff are pretty much complete now. I've just finished counting. We've identified a total of 26 unique bugs across all major Eth2 implementations. So that's pretty much it from fuzzing. I don't know, Danny, if you want to piggyback on this and talk about incident response, or want to do that later.
We're gonna do the normal updates, and then that's our first.
Sounds good.
Cool. Cheers. Thanks, Mehdi. All of that sounds awesome. Other testing and release updates, or any questions regarding some of this? Okay, quick discussion of testnets, Altona, and again, we'll save the incident response till later. But Altona's been running. We did have a little bit of non-finality due to a whale showing up and not running their node. But generally things are looking pretty good. And I think I've reached out directly to client teams to talk about when and what's still on the plates before we're comfortable moving on to a larger scale multi-client testnet, very public facing. And it seems like there's some little things in the works. A couple clients are working on stability issues and hunting down why attestations are not always getting in. And people are hardening up UX. Just making sure that key management is going to look as close to mainnet as possible so that the experience we give people on this testnet carries forward. I'm also working on, I've been playing with some of Proto's scripts to spin up nodes easily to get attack nets to be spun up really easily, and that's something that we're looking to do in the next week and a half, is to have an attack net running in parallel that we're requesting people to please break. My current plan, I think I mentioned this 2 weeks ago, is to, again, we'll talk about the incident in a moment. Other things people want to talk about in testnets. Cool. Great, so we're going to move on to client updates. And we will start with Lodestar.
So past few weeks,
Your mic's pretty low. If you can talk maybe close to the mic.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So last few weeks we merged in our 0.12 branch to master and we started kind of lurking in Altona, trying to sync. We're 0.12 compatible with the exception being Gossip Sub 1.1, which we have not merged in yet. Still a few blockers on the libp2p side to just the larger libp2p side. We started connecting the Chrome debugger to running Lodestar instance. It's really handy for profiling, and in an afternoon, Proto helped us, and we've kind of optimized some pieces of our state transition and to great success. So it's, I think we're going to be in good shape using that tooling. There's still a few blockers on the stability side, so it's not really working fully yet, but we've been making some good progress in the past few weeks. So I feel like we're closing in on something that's kind of like a minimum viable client. We've gotten a few new CLIs working. We've got a validator CLI and an account CLI, so that makes things a lot easier for testing too. So yeah, making good progress.
Great. And were you able to get to Altona's head?
No. So as of last night, I got to, I don't know, I think Epoch roughly 110 or so before I called it quits.
Gotcha. Did an error throw you off, or you just turned off the process?
So there was, we had a bug in our SSZ, which we worked through, and then at that point it was just waiting on syncing and syncing, kind of having a few bottlenecks in our syncing, like archiving blocks and archiving state is a little slow right now.
Gotcha. Thanks, Cayman. Welcome to the Altona party. Trinity.
Hey everyone, similar story, working on getting Trinity to sync Altona. So this week we've been working on refactoring our fork choice so we can implement proto array, which should give us a much more efficient fork choice. Grant has been working on syncing, so he was able to connect to Lighthouse nodes on Altona and could pull down blocks from the network. But again, our sync speed is like way too low, so our next task will be working on performance optimizations.
Cool. Thank you, Alex. Nethermind.
Hey, so in the last 2 weeks, we had to refocus on Ethereum 1 client, and we didn't make much progress on these two. So restart it soon, I hope.
Cool. Curious, did Nethermind see any usage numbers jump after the all-core dev call last week, 2 weeks ago?
Sorry, once again, after the
all-core dev call, was it focused on client diversity? Did Nethermind get a bunch of new users?
Nothing very visible, probably like 10-20% increase.
Cool. I started running one. Thanks to us.
I'm curious. Can I just ask Nethermind, what's your take on running Nethermind as an Eth1 client for the deposits?
So we published an article how to do that. So we were running Girly nodes that would support Prismatic Labs and Lighthouse clients, so the Prism and Lighthouse, and they both worked with Nethermind as the Eth1 deposit provider, the information provider. And at the same time, we are working on binding our own implementations for both. So you can do that, definitely. And we also improved a lot recently because like after we started to have heavy usage of Ethereum 1 for Ethereum 2, the deposits used a lot of the pre-compose related to the cryptography, and we had them slightly slow. And last last month, as part of the preparation for the Berlin hard fork, we made huge improvements of those pre-compos, which means the Gelly in any mode of syncing is much faster now. So it supports Ethereum 2 very, very nicely in Nethermind.
Oh, nice.
Great. Thank you. Nimbus.
Hi. So in the past 2 weeks, we had a lot of work done on fixing bugs raised by Altona, networking gossips, and also we're currently working on the missed attestations. We have audits that will start on Monday. And we are working on auditor's handbook, which is especially valuable because NIM is a completely unknown language to auditors. Link below. And similarly for Altona, lots of work done to help people to onboard people as validators. And the link is also in the chat. And we have an ongoing effort to document and also to debug our code base.
Great. Thank you. I know there's been a little bit of attestation stability issues, maybe the longer you're running the Nimbus client. Is there any headway on that?
We know what it is. We're working on the proper fix. It's an issue in the P2P where Gossip Sub isn't maintaining the mesh correctly.
Okay.
So we expect this to be fixed like in the next few days. Like it's fairly certain at this point what it is.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you very much. Prism.
Hey guys, Terrence from Prismatic Labs. So we have been spending a lot of effort on revamping our accounts key management. So that's underway. We have added new features such as creating new account, listing new account for using direct key store. We're also working on remote key store as well. That is in parallel. And we have started a reference remote signer repo as a proof of concept so people can basically people can study that. We're also working on integrating Supranational's BOS library into runtime, and the initial result looks promising. We're working on cross-compiling with the build so that we can roll it out for our day-to-day user. And there has been significant improvements to the initial sync speed. We've added batch signature verification for block signature, Randall, and the attestation signatures. We're seeing about 2 to 3 times improvement on that, so that's really exciting. We're still working on addressing all the audio feedbacks. There is a lot of them. And then other than that, just constantly bug fixes and then UX support. So yeah, thanks.
Great. Thank you, Terrence. Lighthouse.
Hey everyone. So Paul resumed the work on our REST API, and he's getting very close to having that completed. This is going to help the dev work on our UI, which is about to accelerate in the next couple of days. We've also been working on integrating Blast, the BLS library from Supranational, and started noticing a pretty good 75% increase in our sync speeds on Altona. There's a few things that need to be tidied up on the Rust binding side, but Paul's currently working on this. We are finalizing our peer scoring system that will be introduced in different stages and will allow us to ultimately kick and ban malicious peers connecting to Lighthouse. There's been reports of a deadlock that Age and Paul are currently tracking down, along with some excessive CPU usage that was reported by external users on Altona. We've also observed an issue with our attestation efficiency, where some validators were missing attestations. So the guys are investigating this as a high priority, as you can imagine. Michael has started the work on our slasher. He's currently focusing on the design phase to make sure we get this right and optimize resource consumption. Adam's been refining our database access atomicity, and we've completed our response to the Trail of Bits audit. The report will be public after they perform their retesting of our fixes, which should hopefully happen pretty soon. And we've received 2 proposals from shortlisted vendors for a second security review, and are in the process of organizing and conducting selection interviews. That's pretty much it.
Great. Thank you, Maddie. And Teku.
Hey, everyone. So we finished implementing some improvements to memory management during periods of non-finalization, as well as some other memory optimizations, which means that our memory usage overall is much more stable. Also, in order to speed up the node startup time, we're now persisting proto-array state to disk. So that allows us to avoid reprocessing blocks at startup. Additionally, we've made some peer management improvements related to establishing connections, and we're now prioritizing connections to try and get even exposure across attestation subnets. We've released some small fixes to JVM with P2P and fixed an issue with attestation gossip publishing. We also fixed an interesting bug that was causing us to produce invalid attestations. Adrian has a good write-up on this, so I can post that in chat in a bit. But basically the issue is we were failing to detect chain rewards that due to apparently skipped slots that were later filled by valid blocks. That caused us to fail to recalculate validator duties when epoch boundary blocks changed. And that led us to produce invalid attestations for the wrong slot. So some interesting work tracking that down, and I'll post that right up. And that's it for us.
Great. Thank you, Meredith. Okay, I believe that was everyone. I would like, the next thing on the agenda is incident response. Obviously, we've had, I think with Schlessie, we had an incident that we internally kind of, there was a bug in the spec actually that we rolled out and had clients respond to. And yesterday we had an incident which Prismatic generally handled. Mehdi wanted to just talk about our general approach and strategy moving forward to just responding to incidents on testnets and moving forward onto mainnet. Mehdi, you want to take it?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. Yeah, so nothing really concrete here, but we just had a quick chat with Danny, and I guess wanted to announce that I'll be helping formalize the incident response management for Eth2. So the idea is to have a solid framework that we can all refer to when things go wrong once we're live. So we'll start by defining incident severity levels, working on proper response procedures, who to call when, get a set of easy, first troubleshooting steps that people can follow, put an emergency contact list together, and see if we want to potentially share that with other stakeholders, thinking of staking pools, for example. So yeah, I guess the first step is to create a small working group with ideally a rep from each client, and try to learn from the Eth1 experience, and yeah, make sure people know what to do when things get hairy. So I guess I'll be reaching out to the client teams individually over the next couple of days, and we can start discussing how to put this together next week, if that works with everyone.
Yeah, sounds good. Other than the formation of this working group, does anybody have any comments or thoughts or questions before we move
on? Regarding that, one of the main issue is time zones. We will need to have some kind of follow the sun, where we have multiple peoples depending, like at least 2 people during.
That's what I meant by who to call when, is being able to find the right person depending on the time of the incident and the severity as well.
Okay. Thank you, Mehdi. Yeah, so Mehdi will be reaching out to teams to form a working group to formalize this all. Okay, the next item we have Aditya put together a great document on weak subjectivity, both explaining how it works, explaining how it works in the context of the spec and how it scales according to validator set size. And also, I think there's some recommendations in there on UX because we need to figure out how to deploy these safe states and checkpoints to new users that are syncing the network. And so that probably falls partially onto clients' hands. Aditya, do you want to take it? You can talk about just quick background on what's going on here, and then we can move on to like the UX discussion.
Sure. So basically, weak subjectivity is required in proof of stake chains to avoid the double spend. It's basically one of the more viable attack vectors for proof of stake consensus. And yeah, the document is supposed to be an introduction and not a specification for what to do. But hopefully that gives you an idea of what might go wrong and how we can prevent this. Um, it has the two main tasks that appear are going to be the client-side fork choice handling of weak subjectivity, and then the more important discussion point would be how we distribute these weak subjective states. And that's something that is going to become a regular maintenance task for clients where you update these states that whenever new clients come online, they download from somewhere. And the point to discuss is how this download happens and where this download happens from. And since this is going to be a maintenance task for client teams, we want to get your feedback and your thoughts on how to do this. Yeah, so I've listed 4 methods to do this. So you can either put the state in your code base, in your releases, and new clients just download it de facto. The other way is pass it as a parameter, so that you expect the user to download the state from somewhere and pass it as a CLI parameter when they initialize their client process. The third way is have special boot nodes, which are responsible only for providing this state. So whenever new nodes come online, they'll look up this boot node and download the state from there. And the fourth and the most decentralized way to do this is serve weak subjectivity states over P2P. And this is also the most intensive to implement. But yeah, so if anyone has thoughts, reviews, questions about this, happy to do that now.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so one thing that definitely comes to mind when I think about the trusted boot nodes that might serve you this state is that these boot nodes could be Byzantine. It's very hard to tell. Whereas, like, they could serve user A some state and user B some other state, and actually publicly verifying that that happened, and maybe the social cred of a client team being diminished because of it is kind of difficult. Whereas these being released in signed releases provide a little bit more of this public verifiability. And another thing is that I think regardless of the method, having a -- start state and a user being able to override is also like a very important and powerful component of this. So like, although I can trust what is maybe cut into my release, I can also override it because I can go and look and decide on what the state I believe it is. I think one of the important things is the client team's releasing the state. There's probably 2 primary methods. One is cutting a state root into the release. The other is actually cutting the entire state into the release. Obviously, the state, even in the event that there's 4 million validators, is relatively bound in size. I think it's less than 100 megs, even at that point. So it's not like a crazy state burden on the size of your release, but it is something to consider. But the other thing to consider is the implied in this is a regularity of release. So if you look at some of these numbers, when validator set sizes are very low, the weak subjectivity period becomes very low. And so, if there's only 1,000 validators on the chain, you might need to be cutting releases like every half day, which is like not realistic and not what we're going to ask you to do. But when we start getting to the more realistic validation numbers, say 50,000, 100,000, the 1 week range becomes, I think, an obvious target for releases, and I think there's probably more to work through here than we're going to be able to do on this call, and we might end up doing another call about it. But I think client teams getting in the habit of releasing every 1 week and including updates to either a hash or a state, I think is going to be the same version of this process. If and when we have 300, 400,000 validators, I think that could potentially be pushed to 2 weeks. I'm not looking at the numbers now, so I might be misspeaking. But the 1 week is certainly a good target. Knowing that there's other things to talk about here, but just targeting this one component, is a weekly release something that client teams, one, have maybe already planned on doing, or like a bi-weekly or fortnightly, and two, like is that a feasible thing to manage?
I think there's a philosophical argument to be had here. Like, if we as client teams are expected to sign a release with a safe state, that puts a pretty big target on us to be coerced into signing something else. Or in case of failures, there's a liability question, right? So it's not an entirely comfortable route to go down.
About that, so even if you're coerced into signing something wrong, it won't break the network. It might, tarnish your brand or something, but it definitely won't break the network. So if it happens, because of some bug in the code that you use for this regular release, it's not going to, do much damage.
And I do agree. I hear what you're saying, Asik, and it is kind of this unsolved. Getting these weak subjectivity checkpoints before you've ever synced to the network is kind of this unsolved UX. And so what I'm heavily implying is that one way to solve it is for client teams to be a hand in the normal user flow. But there are probably other ways and worth discussing and debating. One thing that is true is that if a user must get some sort of checkpoint from the recent chain that they want to sync to when they're first syncing. So I guess the meta question here is like, what is the viable UX here? One viable UX. There's sarcasm coming. Is Vitalik can just tweet it like every 5 hours, but that's also probably not like fully a very satisfying solution. There might be other decentralized solutions, like if and when this like state network that people are working on in the 1x research exists. Potentially, there's a way to like query nodes. I don't know. There's a lot there.
What if each client includes a bunch of public keys of known institutions in the Ethereum ecosystem, and you can see that a particular root hash is signed by Ethereum Foundation, Lighthouse, Nimbus, and so on. And this is displayed in the UI, like the user agrees, and it's fetched in some automated way and verified against this root.
Yeah. So we could, instead of, I think that requires a little bit more work and a little bit more of a standard. But I think that pushing on a standard like that would be really valuable. Agreed. I think what is there? We have to standardize maybe like a URL URL scheme for pulling these down in a format and signature, which we can probably pretty easily do. And then defaults for signers are included in a release, and those can be overridden.
Sounds a bit like a web of trust.
That's definitely what it is. When a new client just spins up from scratch, it's definitely going to be a web of trust thing.
Well, the web of trust is more attractive than like explicitly relying on, what is it, for say 5 clients or whatever it might be, or really the one client that you happen to be running, right? Because if it's just one client, then
there's a
like just use Postgres, use Google Drive.
Yep, that's true. But the way I see it, we should definitely implement more than one of these options, where maybe the client signs the root, includes it in its release. Your favorite block explorer advertises the latest subjectivity checkpoint on their website. Some people have posted it on Twitter and like whatever else medium out there. So a multitude of these options should be the preferred approach.
Okay, so it does seem like we're going to want a standard URI for seeing what people have signed, and also a standard URI for pulling down these states once you've decided on, say, the root. And also probably a standard as to the frequency with which some signer might publish these. For someone that wants to serve resubjectivity checkpoints out of band probably doesn't want to be able to serve every single one. So maybe I think in your document you recommend every 256 or something like that. Okay.
I think the issues here is incentives, right? Nobody's really paying the client teams to take on this risk. Like that's the way it is, but
yeah, I understand.
It sounds like we probably should create a working group out of this.
Yeah. Aditya, you want to lead a working group and pull in a member from each team to continue this conversation?
Sure, that sounds good.
Okay. Great. Again, we have to figure this out, like a reasonable UX path somehow, because it's not just a convenience thing, it's a security thing.
So for now, I guess the lowest hanging fruit before we move forward and plan this better is just pass states as CLI parameters. And probably that seems like a pretty trivial thing to implement. So if that's something client teams are up for, that could be done first. And then we figure out how to distribute states, in the general way.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, to highlight, being able to start from a state rather than from Genesis is crucial to this flow. And so if you cannot do that right now, I would make an issue on GitHub and figure out how to be able to do it. It's kind of similar to interop, how we had a flag where we were starting from a state. Zahari?
Yes, I was going to say that we always had that, actually. And I was wondering, isn't this the case?
The immediate issue is that you don't know the block of that state. In the Genesis state, there's whatever in its Genesis block. So
I don't think you need the block.
Well, you don't need it strictly, but in the code, that might be an issue because you might assume that
you can generate it, right? States. You can look at latest block header from the state, and then you can embed the state root in it.
Yeah, it's doable. It's just a missing piece compared to to whatever
Yeah,
is
gotcha,
wrong.
gotcha. But all the information is there that you need, so solvable. Cool. Again, we're gonna form a working group to figure out the good compromise in the UX around here. Otherwise, any questions on this before we move on? Okay. Moving on to research updates. Anybody want to get us started?
I'll talk about some developments at TXRX.
Great.
The work from Anatole is being, this is our transpiler for the spec, is being rolled into Teku. We've talked about that before. And Mikhail has taken that and taken the implementation and made kind of a fully fledged simulator. And now he's doing 2 shards and 16 validators. And kind of the blocks and attestations are being produced on time. Crosslinks are happening. And he's running it using a 120 epoch minimal config, or he ran it for 120 epochs in the minimal config. And he's only really added 1 workaround from what is just standard in the specs. That's good news. And yeah, he's gonna keep working on that.
That's super exciting. Congrats, Mikhail, if you're listening. Other research items?
So one thing that I've been thinking about is the question of whether or not the spec can be changed in a way that allows like basically easier verification of state transitions. So basically the challenge here is kind of looking at some of the big items that take up a lot of computing resources and processing Ethereum blocks, where the 2 biggest ones are signature verification and the VPOC processing. And basically the challenge behind at least end of epoch processing is basically that you have to kind of walk through the entire validator set, and you have to kind of rehash the entire validator balance list and do kind of this computation that involves like basically O of 1 work for every validator. And the thing that I've been trying to figure out is basically, can that work be either reduced or kind of snarked? So the block proposer does a bunch of work and then everyone after them just verifies proofs. So the challenge that there so far is basically that right now we have these validator balances that are stored in a Merkle tree. And the end of epoch processing requires basically recomputing the entire Merkle tree, which is, I think, 1 million hashes. And the first idea that I had is basically, can you use instead of a Merkle tree, something like a gate commitment to store validator balances, right? And basically the kind of reasoning behind that is that a big part of the reason why we have end of epoch processing instead of just immediately processing attestations is that every attestation kind of affects every validator's balance in a fairly it affects a whole bunch of randomly selected validators' balances, and so it affects kind of all parts of the Merkle tree. And so if you try to modify those parts individually, you'll end up doing something that's almost as hard as recomputing the entire tree, but doing that every slot, which is just horrible. But if you use a Kate commitment instead, then basically every balance update becomes an elliptic curve addition, which is potentially like not even an elliptic curve multiplication, like really just an elliptic curve addition, which is potentially really powerful. And the question there basically becomes just like what level of kind of efficiency can we get out of that, right? So the benefits that we get out of just using K commitments. So one is that instead of log-n hashes, it turns into an elliptic curve addition. Another, or potentially a few elliptic curve additions, depending on how you do it. Another benefit is that it might be possible to remove most of the end of epoch per validator processing. So the thing you would still have to do is you would have to kind of figure out at the end, okay, this is the number of attestations that go for with a particular target and source epoch, and then you have to calculate like which ones went above 2/3 and all of those calculations. But anything that's kind of per validator, you can do it more block by block. So the main kind of challenge of that approach is well, so it does seem like you'd be able to do that in a lot of cases, but at the same time, it's only a kind of one gain to one part of the process. Like kind of the limit to the gain comes basically because ultimately you do have to do like in the worst case something like 30,000 signatures in each block, and so you have to do things to 30,000 validators in each block, and that's like the arithmetic is kind of fundamental in that sense. But then arithmetic is kind of much cheaper than doing hashing or doing any kind of other commitments. So the question is basically, could we potentially create a system where like everyone does the arithmetic, but then you go even a step further and you say one person modifies the K commitments or the block proposer modifies the K commitments or modifies whatever, and then they create a basically kind of like a special purpose snark or a special purpose Blanc proof or something like that, that proves that the balances were modified correctly, and then at the end you would well you would not really need to do that much at the end anymore, but every other validator would be able to just verify those proofs. So that's one route, and then obviously the ideal route would be is that like if we can also come up with ways to synarchify like signature verification. So even let's say like we know that we have something like 250, like up to 2,048 validators for every attestation. And so can you just make a proof that says kind of in one go, here is the public key that represents kind of the total sum of this particular subset of validators, and basically just kind of snark that whole transition. So the challenge is basically kind of, can we find subsets of that or kind of ways of doing that that are viable today or close to today, and ideally reduce more complexity than they add, and at the same time makes the transitions more cheaper.
Thanks, Vitalik. Any questions on that? Okay, other research updates? Great. Next up is networking. I was hoping that Felix could join the call, but he could not today. I'll work on getting an update on what's going on Discovery 5 to share with everyone. There is this one issue I pointed to yesterday that was opened up by Raul a couple weeks ago, which is, do we need non-snappy request response domain? Which I think there was a little bit, we got a few different responses on the Discord. It seems like people are leaning towards no, as long as compression ratios are actually where we want. Leo did a little bit of testing on the compression ratios on ETH1 blocks, but we need some data on the ETH2 blocks. So let's not touch snappy versus non-snappy until we get those numbers to sanity check that we're actually seeing reasonable compression. And then my gut would be to just remove the non-snappy, just to remove from maintenance. I don't think that it's very valuable, and as somebody mentioned, Gossip only has Snappy, and so to become a client, that's going to be required. It's a dependency regardless, so it doesn't really give you much gain to operate without Snappy in the request response in like early client development. Any other thoughts on this before we move on? Okay. As I mentioned, we're also working on refining these Gossip subparameters. There's an open PR in the spec repo with a little bit of conversation going on there. And hopefully in a few days we'll have a couple more parameter changes, and I'll make sure to knock on team stores on the networking side to sanity check what we have in there. Backwards compatible, we can upgrade kind of in waves, but ideally this would just be from, these parameters would be updated from the start in the next test set. Yeah, people have been spending a lot of time on networking recently with test nets and bugs and things. Is there anything people want to discuss with respect to the networking spec, or even just debugging, networking, just anything networking related?
I have a branch that adds a message to the goodbye product and to the goodbye call, goodbye message. It renders it kind of incompatible, but there's been a discussion that during debugging, people want to know why they're getting disconnected. It would be similar to the error message, kind of like debugging help, not much else. I'm unsure whether to put this PR up, put this up as a PR. Any initial reactions?
And the other alternative is to expand upon those codes to try to make it more meaningful.
Yep.
I'm going to sit this one out. Any reactions from client teams? It's funny because you could argue that adding a response code is not a breaking change in almost any relevant context, because if I send you a bad message on goodbye, we were going to disconnect anyway. But that's kind of it'd be a sketchy thing to add and say it was backwards compatible.
Well, adding a code strictly isn't a breaking change. Adding a field to the Z is.
Yes.
Right. But then again, like adding a code is useless if nobody uses it for actual logic, and so far no cases have been presented where it would be used for logic.
Right. Again, I'm looking. I'd rather see response from client teams, and if we can't get any right now, Yasik, I suggest you put up the PR and get a response there.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Okay. Other networking things. Okay. I do think that getting some more visibility into gossip is going to be important. I know that we're at least we do see like random attestations not get included, and we really don't have much insight into what's going on there, and so I don't know if anyone on this call has the bandwidth to do that kind of stuff. But if anybody listening to this call wants to dig into gossip and make it more tangible and visible, I think that'd be really valuable. But yeah, I also remember there were a couple of like hackathon projects handful of months ago on gossip sub visualizers and analyzers. So maybe it's worth like revitalizing one of those. Okay, other networking items, about to move on. Great. Spec discussion. This is kind of in the spec range. Mami noted that there is a version 9 of Hash to Curve. Has anyone had a chance to review this? And Sandy checked that it is either only cosmetic or affects components that we don't use. This has come up on anybody's radar.
I've been through it, and it doesn't touch anything that's relevant to us. That's both for version 8 and version 9.
Excellent.
So technically for BLS, if you support hash to curve 7, then you also support hash to curve 9.
Thank you, Carl.
Sure.
Okay. Other spec-related items. Okay. And anything anyone wants to talk about? Open discussion.
I'd like to talk a little bit about using the Eth2 Launchpad and integrating that into clients. After we had that discussion, and yeah, everyone's been working on it, I think we're getting a lot closer on standards for key stores and how to integrate that, but there's still quite a bit of friction in many other clients for how to actually take a key store and include it. So yeah, as I said, I've been going through that. If anyone has any bright ideas, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll be getting a hold of client teams to try work through that a bit with them.
And do you
Carl,
have...
Sorry, is there a document somewhere we can refer to what the outcome of the discussion was, just for reference?
That is a very relevant question. I think someone took notes, but I do not remember who it was off the top of my head, nor do I really have links to that.
If anything, it might have been posted onto the PM issue, so maybe check there. Otherwise, it might be in the Discord channel. I believe there were notes as well. I was not on that call. But what is also relevant is maybe somebody from your team running through the Launchpad and seeing the current outputs of the Launchpad and go banging your head against how you might integrate that into your client. Carl, is there an endpoint that people can refer to and actually use the Launchpad today?
Yes, there is. Just hopping back onto that previous comment, it looks like Mami took notes and listed them in the repo, so you can have a look at them. Thanks, Mami, for that. Yes, so in terms of an endpoint, currently this website sent in the chat is the endpoint for it is the endpoint for the Launchpad, and you need a password that'll be changed shortly. And I'm chatting with DevOps at the moment to get it posted on a slightly more proper website. But for now, that's an endpoint, and everything should just work. And that is pointing at the master branch of the ETH2 deposit repo.
Right, and when you finish this process, what do you have as a validator? What files do you have? Just so people know.
So at the end of this process, you have one key store per validator in a file that is explained in the Launchpad itself, as well as in the CLI you're going to be walked through. It will tell you where those key stores are. as well as a deposit data.json, which obviously contains the deposit data. There's only a single deposit data with an array of deposits for each validator. It doesn't quite map to what is a deposit data on the Eth2 spec side, because there's some extra parameters that we want to verify, but it is very close. There's nothing unexpected there.
And you presumably have a mnemonic that you wrote down?
Yes, you have a mnemonic written down, and the user will have a password in their head, and the single password encrypts all of their validators. Otherwise, that gets very user-friendly if you're going to have many, many deposits.
Okay. So I mean, the same thing to do here is probably for client teams to run through this. Consider how these outputs would be integrated into your client. If there are sticking points on why this is not a viable format, to open up the conversation with Carl and us. But otherwise, to consider how to support that pretty easily from your client side. You know, like client launchpad integration, point to file, done, something like that. But go through it. Have someone on your team go through it so that we can sort some of these things out in the next couple of weeks, because we plan on having this launched with the next testnet.
Yeah, that all sounds like a very reasonable approach. And also then, if on the client side, everyone can add how this kind of thing would be supported in their docs, that would be really cool. And then obviously on the Launchpad side too, we can have maybe an outline of what that is before pointing to client docs. I think it's probably a good way of handling the handoff between the Launchpad and clients themselves. Because presumably at this point, most people are not going to have clients installed, or will have, but for the wrong version and that kind of thing.
Okay, anything else on this before we move on?
Not from my side.
Okay. Anything else before we close? Great. Thank you, everyone. It's a good meeting. Talk to you all soon.
Thanks, Ronnie. Bye all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Bye.